The wind howled through the abandoned streets of Helena, Montana, carrying with it the bitter chill of a winter night. Snowflakes drifted lazily beneath dim streetlights, settling on the rooftops of worn-down houses, each one telling a story of time and hardship. At the far end of town, past rows of shuttered businesses and vacant lots, stood a house that had long been forgotten, just like the man inside it. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the house, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The door opened, and Donald Trump stepped out, his sharp gaze scanning the desolate surroundings. Something about this place felt off, like a town that had simply given up. He adjusted his coat against the biting wind and strode toward a small roadside diner, the only building still showing signs of life. As he pushed open the door, the bell above jingled softly, but the moment he stepped inside, all conversation stopped. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Eyes darted toward him, some filled with curiosity, others with something closer to resentment. A few recognized him instantly, but no one dared to speak first. Trump stepped forward, his voice steady and firm. "I'm looking for Samuel Grayson." A heavy silence followed. A man at the counter shifted uncomfortably, lowering his cup of coffee before murmuring, "You don't want to go near him. He's not the man he used to be." Trump's expression didn't change. He had heard the whispers, the stories of a brilliant man whose name had been buried beneath scandal and sorrow. But he hadn't come all this way to turn back now. Something inside that forgotten house held a secret, one that could change everything. Donald Trump stood outside the dilapidated house, its paint peeling, windows clouded with dust. It wasn't just a house, it was a relic of a life that had once thrived, now reduced to silence and neglect. He knocked on the door. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. A shuffle of footsteps sounded from inside, followed by the creak of an old wooden floor. The door cracked open just an inch, revealing weary, bloodshot eyes and a gruff voice filled with exhaustion and mistrust. "I don't fix cars anymore. Go away." Trump didn't flinch. His voice remained steady. "I didn't come for a car, Samuel. I came for you." For a long moment, silence hung in the air. Then, with a reluctant sigh, Samuel Grayson stepped into the dim light. Once, he had been a man of brilliance, an engineer ahead of his time. In the 1980s, he had worked on Sentinel-1, the presidential limousine, one of the most secure vehicles ever built. His mind had helped protect leaders, shape industries, even push the limits of NASA's high-performance engine systems. His hands had once built machines that defined the future. But now, those hands were rough, scarred, trembling slightly as he leaned against the doorframe. His hair, once neatly combed, was unkempt, streaked with gray in years of neglect. His eyes, once sharp with intelligence, were hollow with regret. Trump took a slow step forward. "What happened to you, Samuel?" The old mechanic let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. His voice, barely above a whisper, carried decades of pain. "I lost everything." Samuel Grayson's story wasn't one the town liked to talk about. It was a wound they had chosen to ignore. In 2005, Afghanistan, his son, Daniel Grayson, a U.S. Marine, had been killed in action. But it wasn't just war that took Daniel's life, it was the whispers that followed. Rumors spread like wildfire, that Samuel had leaked classified information about the Sentinel-1 project to the military. Some claimed that because of him, Daniel's unit had been ambushed. The accusations were never proven, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The government cut ties with him. His colleagues turned their backs. His wife left, taking with her the last shred of hope he had. And the town, once proud of his name, now spoke of him in hushed, bitter tones, a traitor, a disgrace. Samuel fell into darkness. He lost his job, his home, his purpose. He drowned himself in alcohol, trying to forget. Until all that was left of him was this rundown house, and a dusty garage hiding a secret the world had long since abandoned. Trump stepped past the threshold, his sharp gaze sweeping over the small, cluttered living room. It was more than just messy, it was a graveyard of memories. Stacks of old newspapers teetered in uneven piles, empty beer bottles lined the dusty windowsill, and the air carried the heavy scent of time long forgotten. But among the wreckage of a life unraveled, something caught his eye, a single framed photograph sitting on a rickety table. He picked it up, brushing off the dust. The image was faded but still powerful. Daniel Grayson, in full Marine uniform, stood tall and proud, his smile full of life. Beside him, a younger Samuel, his eyes filled with the kind of pride only a father could understand. Trump turned the frame toward Samuel. "This man wasn't a failure," Trump said, his voice firm. "He was a father. A damn good one." Samuel's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists as if trying to hold back a lifetime of emotion. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the back of the house. Trump followed, sensing that this was where the real story began. They stopped in front of a garage door covered in rust and cobwebs. Samuel hesitated for a moment, then let out a deep breath and pulled it open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the door slid upward, revealing a space frozen in time. Dust swirled in the dim light of a single, flickering bulb, casting long shadows against the walls. And there, in the center of it all, sat a car unlike anything Trump had ever seen. Its body was sleek but unfinished, a fusion of salvaged metal and custom-built parts. The hood was smooth, the curves deliberate, but what stood out most was the careful preservation. This wasn't an abandoned project. It was something Samuel had been working on, keeping alive, waiting for the right moment to finish. Trump ran his hand over the cool metal. "What is this, Samuel?" Samuel exhaled, his fingers brushing against the hood like he was touching something sacred. "It's my life's work. And the reason they destroyed me." Trump raised an eyebrow. "They destroyed you over a car?" Samuel let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "This isn't just a car, Trump. This is the car they never wanted the world to see." He stepped around the vehicle, his voice growing steady, yet tinged with the weight of old frustration. "It runs on hydrogen. Pure, clean energy. No gasoline. No pollution. No dependence on oil. A machine that could have revolutionized the industry." He clenched his jaw. "And they made sure it never saw the light of day." Trump's eyes narrowed. Now it made sense. Samuel Grayson hadn't just been another mechanic. He had been a threat, a direct challenge to the billion-dollar oil industry. A man whose name needed to be erased, whose reputation had to be buried. Samuel's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. They knew if this got out, it would change everything. Trump studied him carefully. There was something deeper here, something beyond a forgotten invention. A brilliant engineer suddenly cast out. A car hidden from the world. And a son who had died in Afghanistan right when his father was working on this technology. That wasn't a coincidence. Trump's voice was low but firm. "Samuel, do you think Daniel's death had something to do with this?" Samuel froze. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to convince myself it was just war. That he was in the wrong place at the wrong time." His hand clenched into a fist. "But Daniel knew about this. He knew what I was working on. And right before he deployed, he told me something." Samuel swallowed hard, his voice cracking under the weight of memory. "He told me, Dad, be careful who you trust." The air in the garage grew heavier. This wasn't just about an invention anymore. This was about a cover-up. A hidden truth. A man who had lost everything, and a son who might have died trying to protect his father's name. Trump set the framed photograph of Daniel down carefully, then placed his hand on the car's hood. "If what you're saying is true, Samuel, then this story isn't over yet." Samuel Grayson stood frozen, his weathered hands gripping the edges of his old workbench. The air inside the garage was thick, not just with dust, but with something heavier. Something unsaid. His son's words echoed in his mind, haunting him like a ghost he could never shake. "Dad, be careful who you trust." Trump didn't move. He had seen this look before, the look of a man standing at the edge of a revelation too painful to say out loud. "Samuel," Trump said slowly, "your son, did he know something? Did he tell you anything else before he left?" Samuel exhaled, his breath shaky. He reached into a nearby drawer, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out a small, folded envelope. It was yellowed with time, the edges worn from years of being handled. Without a word, he handed it to Trump. Trump carefully unfolded the letter. It was written in neat, deliberate handwriting, Daniel's handwriting. The date at the top was chilling, just days before his final deployment. "Dad. If you're reading this, it means something happened to me. But don't let them silence you. You were never the traitor they made you out to be. The real criminals are the ones who are afraid of what you've built. Don't let them win. I love you, Dad. Always. Daniel." Trump stared at the words, the weight of them sinking into his chest. He had read countless letters from fallen soldiers before, messages of love, regret, hope, but this was different. This wasn't just a goodbye. It was a warning. He looked up at Samuel, who was gripping the edge of the workbench so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His eyes were glassy, but he refused to let the tears fall. "For years," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I thought I lost my son because of some mistake I made. Because of those rumors. But what if," he swallowed hard. "What if he died protecting me?" Trump set the letter down carefully, pressing his fingers against the worn paper as if holding the weight of history itself. "This wasn't just war," he said, his voice firm. "Someone wanted your name buried. And your son, he knew it." Samuel turned away, his hands running through his graying hair. He let out a bitter chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "I spent years drowning in guilt, blaming myself. And all this time, it wasn't my failure. It was theirs." Trump nodded. "And it's time we prove it." Samuel looked at him, something flickering in his tired eyes, something that hadn't been there in years. Hope. That night, Trump made calls. A lot of them. Old connections. Trusted allies. Investigators who still owed him favors. He didn't care how long it took, he wanted answers. And what they uncovered was bigger than either of them had imagined. Samuel's invention, his hydrogen-powered car, hadn't been silenced because of safety concerns. It had been silenced because it was a threat. A direct threat to billion-dollar oil industries. A major energy corporation had lobbied behind closed doors, paying off government officials to ensure Samuel's project never saw the light of day. Local authorities in Montana had been bribed to keep him blacklisted, to let his name rot. And worse, Daniel's unit in Afghanistan. They had been stationed near a site linked to that same corporation. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a cover-up. Trump sat across from Samuel the next morning, the sun barely rising over the Montana horizon. The once-forgotten mechanic sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that had been hidden from him for almost 2 decades. "They took everything from me," Samuel finally muttered. His voice wasn't broken anymore. It was steady. "My name. My career. My son." Trump leaned forward. "Then it's time to take it back." Samuel met his gaze. And for the first time in years, he believed. The morning air in Montana was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. But inside Samuel Grayson's small, dimly lit house, the air was thick with something else, something unshakable. Truth. Trump sat across from Samuel at the battered kitchen table, a stack of papers spread out between them. They weren't just any papers. They were proof. Proof that Samuel's revolutionary hydrogen-powered car had been buried, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. Proof that a major energy corporation had paid off officials, ensuring Samuel's project never left the garage. And worst of all, proof that Daniel Grayson's unit in Afghanistan had been stationed near a site linked to that same corporation. The pieces were fitting together in a way that was impossible to ignore. Samuel stared at the documents, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Rage. "They took everything from me," he muttered, his voice raw. "My son, my name, my future." Trump leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Then let's take it back." That afternoon, Trump made a surprise visit to the office of Mayor Walter Harrison, the longtime leader of Helena, Montana. A man whose smiling face had appeared in newspapers for decades, shaking hands and making promises. But behind closed doors, he had been bought and paid for. Trump didn't bother with pleasantries. He walked into the mayor's office, tossed a thick folder onto the desk, and folded his arms. "Explain this." Harrison glanced at the papers, his expression shifting from mild confusion to something closer to fear. He swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. I don't know what this is." Trump's voice was ice cold. "Don't play dumb, Walter. You took bribes to keep Samuel Grayson's name buried. You let him rot while your friends in the oil industry made sure his invention never saw the light of day." The mayor's face turned pale. "That's ridiculous. There's no proof." Trump cut him off. "Oh, there's plenty of proof. And soon, the whole country is going to see it." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time in his long career, Mayor Walter Harrison realized he wasn't dealing with just anyone. He was dealing with Donald J. Trump. Within days, the story exploded. Trump called for a national press conference, standing beside Samuel Grayson as he told the world the truth. He brought in engineers, mechanics, and energy experts to validate Samuel's invention, proving that it wasn't just a wild theory, it was real. He aired Daniel Grayson's letter on live television, reading the words of a fallen Marine who had died protecting his father's legacy. And most importantly, he called out corruption by name. He exposed the energy executives, the government officials, the local politicians who had sold out the future for their own gain. The public erupted. Social media went wild. Hashtags like #JusticeForSamuel and #DanielDidn'tDieInVain trended worldwide. News networks ran the story 24/7. How could a veteran like Daniel be silenced for protecting his father? How could a car that could change the world be buried for corporate greed? How could an entire town abandon a man who had once served his country in ways they couldn't even imagine? Samuel Grayson watched from the sidelines, his hands trembling, not from pain, but from something he hadn't felt in years. Vindication. He was no longer the town disgrace. No longer the man they whispered about in diners and grocery stores. He was a hero. As the investigations began, the fallout was swift and brutal. The mayor resigned in disgrace, his legacy shattered. Executives from the energy corporation were subpoenaed, forced to answer for their actions. Government officials who had taken bribes to suppress Samuel's work were exposed. Some were arrested. Others simply vanished, hoping to escape the storm. And at the center of it all was Samuel, a man they had tried to erase, now standing in the spotlight. As reporters crowded around him, asking what came next, Samuel turned to Trump. Trump met his gaze and nodded. "It's time to finish what you started." Samuel swallowed hard. For years, he had been broken. For years, he had let them win. Not anymore. He would build the car. He would prove them wrong. And this time, the whole world would be watching. The world was watching. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered into their microphones, and a sea of people gathered outside the garage that had once been Samuel Grayson's prison. But today, it wasn't a place of failure or regret. Today, it was the birthplace of a revolution. In the center of it all sat Samuel's hydrogen-powered car, the machine that had been buried for decades, the invention that could have changed the world long ago. Now, under the glaring lights of live television, it was finally getting its moment. Samuel stood beside the car, his old, calloused hands resting on the hood. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. For years, he had convinced himself that this moment would never come. That the world had moved on. That he would die as the man they had painted him to be, a disgraced engineer, a traitor, a nobody. But now, thanks to Donald Trump, the truth had been unearthed. Trump stood at his side, his presence commanding, his gaze fixed on the crowd. He had done what no one else dared to do, he believed in Samuel when no one else would. And now, with the nation's eyes on them, he was making sure that no one would ever forget what had been taken from this man. A lead engineer from one of the country's top tech firms stepped forward. "Everything set, Samuel," he said. "It's time." Samuel swallowed hard, gripping the key in his fingers. He took a deep breath. This was it. For 20 years, he had lived in exile. 20 years of hearing his name spoken in hushed whispers. 20 years of drowning in guilt, believing the lie that he was responsible for his son's death. Not anymore. With one smooth motion, he slid into the driver's seat. His hands wrapped around the steering wheel, hands that had once built machines for presidents, hands that had once held his son's shoulder before he left for Afghanistan, hands that had once shaken from alcohol and regret. But today, they were steady. He turned the key. For a second, silence. Then, the engine roared to life. But it wasn't like any engine they had heard before. It wasn't the deep, guttural growl of a gasoline motor. It was smooth, powerful, clean, the hum of a machine built for the future. The crowd erupted. Cheers. Applause. Shouts of disbelief. A reporter turned to the camera, her voice shaking with emotion. "This isn't just a car," she said. "This is history being rewritten." Samuel stepped out of the vehicle, his chest rising and falling with deep, shaky breaths. It had worked. He had been right all along. For the first time in years, he wasn't a failure. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The footage of the successful test drive spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media exploded. News stations ran the story non-stop. Analysts called it the most important technological breakthrough of the decade. But for the American people, it was more than that. It was a symbol. A symbol of resilience, of a man who had refused to stay buried. A symbol of justice, of the truth finally coming to light. A symbol of sacrifice, of a son who had given his life to protect his father's legacy. Within 48 hours, the government launched new investigations into corruption in the energy sector. The mayor had already resigned in disgrace, but now, executives from major oil corporations were being subpoenaed. Samuel Grayson's name was cleared. And for the first time in 2 decades, he could hold his head high. As the celebrations continued, a staff member approached Samuel with a small, sealed envelope. "Sir, we found this among Daniel's old belongings." Samuel's fingers trembled as he took it. Slowly, he opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. The handwriting was familiar. Daniel's. "Dad. If you're reading this, it means you finally did it. I always knew you would. You were never the traitor they made you out to be. You were never the failure you believed you were. You were always my hero. I hope that wherever I am, I get to see you drive that car one day. And I hope you finally smile again. With all my love. Daniel." Samuel clenched the letter against his chest. His eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't from pain. They were from peace. For the first time in 20 years, he felt his son standing beside him again. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a part of him. Trump approached, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Well, Samuel. What's next?" Samuel exhaled, looking at the car. No longer just a machine. No longer just a dream. It was a revolution. "I think," he said, a small smile breaking through, "it's time to build more of them." Trump grinned. "Then let's get to work." And with that, a new chapter began. Samuel Grayson, the man who had lost everything, was now the man leading a revolution. Not just for himself. Not just for his son. But for the future. The sun was setting over Montana, casting a golden glow over the town that had once turned its back on Samuel Grayson. But today, the streets were alive. People gathered in clusters, some cheering, others wiping away tears as the news played on storefront televisions and cell phone screens. The man they had once shunned had just changed history. Inside his garage, the same garage that had once been a prison of regret, Samuel stood beside his hydrogen-powered car, running his fingers over the hood. But this time, he wasn't looking at it as an unfinished dream. It was real. It was happening. Trump leaned against the workbench, watching him. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Samuel let out a small chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "I spent 20 years thinking this moment would never come." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had built machines for presidents, the same hands that had trembled under the weight of a whiskey bottle, the same hands that had spent 2 decades grasping for something to hold on to. And now, they were steady. Trump pushed himself off the workbench, stepping forward. "The world's watching, Samuel. What do you want to do next?" Samuel exhaled, glancing at the car one last time before turning to face him. "I want to build more." Trump nodded, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Then let's make it happen." The momentum was unstoppable. By morning, the White House had issued an official statement. The federal government was launching a full-scale investigation into the suppression of alternative energy technologies. Energy executives were subpoenaed. Oil industry lobbyists scrambled to cover their tracks. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the dark. Meanwhile, Samuel's garage, once a forgotten relic, became a hub of activity. Engineers, mechanics, and innovators from across the country came to Montana to see the car that could change everything. Investors reached out, not with empty promises, but with real capital. This wasn't just a story of redemption anymore. This was a movement. Weeks later, Samuel stood on a stage in front of a massive crowd. Flags waved in the wind. A banner hung above the podium. "The future is now." Trump stood beside him as Samuel adjusted the microphone, his voice strong and unwavering. "For 20 years, they told me I was wrong. That my ideas were impossible. That my name wasn't worth remembering." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. "But today, we prove them wrong. Today, we take back the future." The crowd erupted. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of his mind, Samuel could hear his son's voice. "You did it, Dad." And for the first time in 20 years, Samuel Grayson finally smiled. The story of Samuel Grayson isn't just about one man's fight for justice, it's about something much bigger. It's about resilience. It's about truth. And most of all, it's about the power of never giving up. For 20 years, Samuel lived in the shadows, believing the world had beaten him. He let the weight of guilt, failure, and loss define him. But the truth? The world hadn't beaten him, he had let himself believe it had. How many of us do the same? How often do we let fear, doubt, and the voices of others convince us that we're not enough? That our dreams aren't worth fighting for? That our failures define us? But they don't. Samuel's story teaches us that the past does not have to be our future. That no matter how broken we feel, no matter how much time has passed, we can rise again. It takes just one moment, one choice, one act of courage to turn everything around. It also reminds us that the truth always finds a way. Powerful forces may try to bury it, whether it's corporate greed, political corruption, or even our own self-doubt, but the truth is relentless. And when it finally comes to light, it changes everything. And perhaps the most important lesson: one person believing in you can change your entire life. For Samuel, that person was Donald Trump. Someone who saw past the rumors, the failures, the years of exile, and instead, saw the man he could be. And maybe, just maybe, the lesson for all of us is that we need to be that person for someone else.